Okay, welcome back, and I assume you listened to the first clip, which introduces how the report was written and when it was launched back in November 2019. And the opening session looked at the difficult history, the difficult sort of theological beginnings of Christian-Jewish relations. And now we're looking at a distinctive relationship, which is the heading of the second part of the report. And this report really affirms, very helpfully from CMJ's perspective, the Jewish identity of Jesus and also the Jewish identity of Paul. If you go to the Anglican report on page 44, it really says something very helpful about the Jewish identity of Paul. And let me just actually give that little quote to you, what he says there on the report, because I think some people kind of lose sight of the Jewishness of Paul, and the report says this: throughout Paul's writing, Paul clearly identifies as a Jew in the present tense throughout his letters. So, in a sense, Paul is a man of multiple identities, but his Jewishness remains constant before his encounter with Jesus on the Damascus Road and post that transformative experience of meeting and being changed and transformed by the risen Jesus. So the report looks at the distinctive relationship between Jews and Christians, but it affirms the Jewish identity of Jesus and the Jewish identity of Paul. And it talks about the relationship in terms of kinship and divergence. So there's common ground, but there's also differences. And I think in looking at that, from a CMJ perspective, kinship and divergence perhaps is helpful, but we would probably prefer the term continuity and discontinuity. And again, in the discussion and the questions at the end of this section, that particular debate is opened up for you. Also, this report, in looking at the distinctive relationship, looks at the issue of who gets to define who God's people are. It looks at the legitimacy and the difficulty of the term God's chosen people. Really this is taken up again in later on in the Anglican report, in part 3 of their report. But there's this discussion about who is God's chosen people and how can we define that. The biblical focus in this section is on Romans 9 to 11. And again, if you go to the Anglican report, there's a quotation here about the importance of Romans 9 to 11. And it says this: Romans 9 to 11 provides the most sustained, direct treatment in the New Testament of the question of what the lack of recognition of God's work in Christ on the part of most Jewish people means for the theological understanding of the Jewish people collectively as Israel. So whatever one understands about the relationship between the church and Jewish people, about the understanding of election and God's chosenness of Israel, whatever you understand, I think the work has to be done on Romans 9 to 11. So this has always been the view of CMJ. And if you go back to the reports I mentioned in section 1, those various church documents, again, the biblical footnotes, the biblical material being explored will almost certainly be, in the majority of cases, taking seriously Romans 9 to 11. My own little book, The Case for Enlargement Theology, wrestles with this idea of election, and on pages 190 to 196, there's a real discussion of how we understand God's chosen people, both in terms of Israel, both in terms of the faithful remnant within Israel, Jewish believers in Jesus, and how we can apply the term to the church. So there's different images and explanations of that in this book. Again, you might not agree with it all, but I think if you engage with it, it will certainly help the discussion to take place. So the report then continues, and there's a number of important questions. And again, we list those questions for discussion in our booklet. But there's a number of resources which are really helpful at this point. Again, I mentioned my own book here, but probably one of the best books looking at this issue of this difficult relationship, this disputed identity, is a book called Jewish Believers in Jesus, and it's by two Scandinavian scholars. And again, all the details are on the details in our booklet. This book is also perhaps best known in this area by the scholar R. Kendall Sulan. It's called The God of Israel and Christian Theology. Again, I think that's very helpful, and again, CMJ has promoted this book over a number of years. And in addition to those books, there's a number of CMJ resources, and again, they're listed. But there's two I would like to particularly bring to your attention, two Olive Press papers. One is about one of our great evangelists and theologians from CMJ, a guy called Dr. Jakob Joss. It's an Olive Press paper by Dr. Teresa Newell, and this is really important. And my own little paper here, Knowing Jesus in His Jewish Context, again reaffirms and develops the points made in the Anglican report about the Jewishness of Jesus and about the way in which there is this contested identity between Jews and Christians, and often the Messianic Jewish world should be the bridge to helping us understand that. But sadly, in this report, the Anglican report, and elsewhere, often there is a degree of marginalisation of Messianic Jewish believers. I'm not sure if that is subconscious or if it's deliberate, but either way, that is a disappointment. So I hope those questions and discussions will help you engage with this second part of the report, at looking at this distinctive relationship. Thank you for listening, and join me back in a moment for session 3.